Well, it finally happened. On Tuesday, the 5th of August 2025, after a months-long selection process, Australians woke up to news, first leaked by the foreign press, that the Australian government had selected Mitsubishi Heavy Industries' new FFM, or Evolved Mogami, for Project C3000, rather than TKMS's MECO A200. Many who have been watching this acquisition process for a while always thought that the Mogami was in the box seat to win, though I'm not going to pretend that I was necessarily one of them. You won't exactly need to do much sleuthing to find my last video on the topic, where I said it was likely basically a coin toss between the two shortlisted options. And in fact, the ABC apparently had very well-sourced reporting suggesting that Navy wanted to go the other way on the choice, on the basis of lower risk and lower acquisition cost, and that the National Security Committee of Cabinet chose the Mogami despite this expressed preference. Mogami was always going to be the more technically capable vessel, but the A200 had benefits of its own, mostly stemming from the ADF's inherent familiarity with the class due to its lineage being the same as that of the existing Anzac frigates. In the end, the choice was made to take the higher risk, higher reward option and swing for the fences with Mogami. In this video, we'll look at what this choice means for Australia and the RAN, which factors probably led to the selection of the Mogami over the MECO, what we're gaining, and what we're giving up. As this is my third video on C3000, I won't go too deep describing the two contenders. Feel free to go back and look at the last video on this topic for a deeper dive into both the MECO and the Mogami. Instead, to save time, I'll just give the 30,000 foot summary. The MECO A200, from the German design firm TKMS, comes from the well-known and widely adopted MECO design family, an earlier version of which also formed the basis for the RAN's existing Anzac class. The ship as offered was a 118-metre frigate with a fully loaded displacement of around 3,900 tonnes. The precise fit-out being offered was never made public, but reporting suggested it was offered in two variants. A stock variant, essentially identical to the Al Aziz class, which was acquired by the Egyptian Navy and which operates a full suite of mostly European sensors and weapons, and an Australianised variant, which would likely have been the ADF's preferred option. We mostly have to speculate as to the exact loadout which TKMS was proposing in this variant, but it likely would have been equipped with the Saab 9LV CMS, or its currently under development successor, the Australian designed and manufactured CFAR radar, and an armament suite consisting of probably 8 naval strike missiles, 16 Mark 41 VLS cells, and a variety of gun and torpedo systems. The Evolved Mogami, which ultimately won the competition, is a very different vessel. Significantly larger at 142 metres long and 6,200 tonnes full load displacement, Mogami is also better armed, with 32 strike-length Mark 41 VLS cells and a C-RAM missile system for close-in defence, complementing the 8 anti-ship missiles, 5-inch gun, and suite of torpedoes and smaller guns which probably would have been common between both designs. Unlike the TKMS offering, the Mogami will utilise an entirely Japanese sensor suite and combat management system. Now, as promised, that's barely skimming the surface of either ship, so please feel free to go back a couple of videos and have a look if you want a much more in-depth comparison. But, with the Mogami now selected, let's start with the positives and look at what probably got it over the line. The first major differentiator between the two ships was simple capability. In fact, during his press conference announcing the decision, Defence Minister Richard Marles claimed that, quote, "This decision is entirely based on the capability of the respective ships," end quote, and that the decision was, quote, "about how we can get the best platform, the best capability for the Royal Australian Navy," end quote. And I have no doubt that that is true. But it's also true that he immediately pivoted from that statement to the significance of the bilateral relationship between Australia and Japan, and it would be naive to pretend that that wasn't also a hugely significant factor in the government's decision-making calculus. But we'll get back to that later. For now, let's take him at his word and focus on capability alone. First, and most immediately obvious, the larger magazine of 32 VLS cells versus 16 was clearly a major boost for Mogami over the MECO, and got a mention in the press conference. 32 cells give the Mogami enormous flexibility which the German ship simply didn't have the physical space to match. Fully kitted out with ESSMs, The Mogami could potentially pack as many as 128 interceptors, or a more reasonable loadout, which might include SM-6s and SM-2s for longer range air defense. There are even enough cells that it's not inconceivable to imagine a standard loadout including a handful of Tomahawks. Perhaps 8 land attack missiles, 8 SM-2s, 8 SM-6s and 32 ESSMs might be a fairly typical general purpose loadout, and would balance capability, flexibility and magazine depth. All of that additional firepower which the Mogami can boast, however, does come with a trade-off. It means that the RAN is having to give up the extremely potent combination of CFAR radar and 9LV combat system which currently equips the Anzacs, and which would almost certainly have equipped the MECO had it been chosen. Though not as good as a full-on Aegis setup like in the Hobarts, the modernised Anzacs, post-AMCAP, are reputed to be surprisingly potent air defenders within the limitations of the ESSM and their 8-cell VLS. The new FFM design has certainly seen significant upgrades in the air defense realm as compared to the original Mogami, but the Japanese-designed OPY-2 derived radar it's going to be equipped with, while no doubt highly advanced, is unlikely to be as capable as the CFAR-2, and the Evolved Mogami is still going to be reliant to some significant extent on its EO/IR detection systems for air warfare. Again, these are certain to be excellent, but by their nature these systems, especially the electro-optical, tend to be short-ranged. Overall, this probably adds up to the Evolved Mogami being certainly competent in the air warfare domain, but with an emphasis being on what is, at least by ASW frigate standards, quite a large magazine, over more capable sensors. Shooting over seeing, basically. While the MECO would have had better, longer range sensors, but fewer missiles to do anything about what it saw coming at it. Outside of its defensive armament, Mogami has 3 major selling points that I think probably also contributed to getting it across the line versus the MECO. The first is its famously small crew size. 90 people can crew the ship in peacetime, and reportedly as few as 60 are required in wartime. There is zero doubt in my mind that this would have been a huge factor in the decision, especially given that Navy and the ADF more generally are known to be battling personnel shortages right now. Fewer people aren't a panacea. After all, people aren't perfectly fungible, and if a specific, specialized and critical skill set isn't available, then it doesn't matter if your ship needs 90 crew or 900, it's staying tied up at dock. But ultimately, a smaller crew is likely to be a good thing, once the personnel on board get used to it, and any fatigue or other issues get identified and ironed out. The Mogami's second party trick is its enormous range of 10,000 nautical miles. That's a nearly 70% improvement over the Anzac and 30% greater than the MECO A200 would have offered. I wanted to include a map showing how far 10,000 nautical miles actually is, but frankly it got a little silly. On a straight line basis, almost regardless of where you center it in Australia, the plotted distance encompasses almost every point on the entire planet, except for a little patch in the North Atlantic. The map you see on screen now is in fact half of the ship's declared range, just 5,000 nautical miles, which means, in theory, a Mogami operating out of Fleet Base West could go essentially anywhere in the Indian Ocean and come all the way back again completely independent of any replenishment or refueling at sea, while the same ship operating out of Fleet Base East could easily cruise to Hawaii or northern Japan, come back and still have plenty of fuel in the tank. And beyond the sheer engineering endurance, the Mogami's large size and small crew likely also give it room for the freezer and general storage space, the onboard facilities, and the other intangibles which make it practical rather than just technically possible for the ship to undertake long seagoing patrols, with the biggest limitation probably going to end up being human fatigue given that small crew. Suffice it to say, this is a vessel that can go a long, long way on its own, something that is probably going to be increasingly appreciated by the RAN if Australia's fleet continues to find itself lacking appropriate numbers of large support ships, which, based on the current IIP at least, is looking frustratingly likely over the coming decades. Finally, the Mogami likely also had a significant edge in undersea warfare relative to the MECO. Built from the ground up as a sub-hunter, the Mogami is designed to be stealthy, not just a radar, but also to hydrophones listening out from below. In addition to its anti-sub capabilities, however, Mogami also boasts inherent mine warfare capability. With dedicated anti-mine sonar and all the onboard equipment required to undertake mine warfare, including unmanned vehicles, the Mogamis will fill a hole that is being left in the RAN by the retirement of its fleet of Huon-class mine hunters. Now, I've said in the past, and stand by the idea, that we shouldn't be planning on tying up 6,200-ton major surface combatants doing mine hunting, something that a far smaller and cheaper ship could be doing with far less opportunity cost. But if the RAN are determined to retire their dedicated mine warfare ships without a real replacement, then at least having that capability on these frigates is significantly better than losing it altogether. Finally, we know that a couple of non-capability elements definitely did play a role in the selection. Price, as always, was a factor, though Defence recommended the MECO on acquisition price and overall project risk grounds. The Mogami apparently won out on whole-of-life price, most likely due to both the very small crew mentioned earlier, and therefore lower through-life personnel costs, but also the 40-year hull life for the vessels, significantly longer than more traditional vessels like the MECO, which are generally designed to cap out somewhere between 20 and 30 years. Now, there may potentially be some false economy there. It's not hard to imagine ways in which naval combat might evolve between now and the 2070s and 2080s that might render these vessels tactically irrelevant. But it's also possible to imagine ways that the ships themselves might evolve at the same time and keep right on trucking. So that's an area where we might just have to wait and see. Speed to delivery was also relevant. Per Pat Conroy, the Mogami was the only frigate in the competition which the government expected to meet the timeline it demanded, with the first ship being delivered in 2029 and commissioned in 2030, and with 2 more entering service by 2034. And lastly, it's been reported pretty credibly that the Americans also put a bit of a thumb on the scale for the Mogami, most likely because of the vessel's excellent existing capacity to integrate with the US Navy and its systems, something they would certainly like to see carry over into the RAN as well. So those are, mostly, the positives, the reasons why the Mogami was probably chosen over the MECO, but they shouldn't be taken to suggest that picking the Mogami doesn't come with negatives, though, to be honest, there really aren't that many. We've already briefly covered the absence of the CFAR radar, but Mogami is also coming with a Japanese CMS. Actually, technically an American-designed CMS adopted by the Japanese, but one which will still be unique in the Australian fleet. Every other major surface combatant in the fleet, from the Hunter and Hobart down to the Arafura, utilises 9LV, either directly or to interface with Aegis. And the absence of 9LV hurts more than just Australian parochialism for local systems. Sailors trained with 9LV can essentially move between combatants with minimal training friction. They will have to learn their new vessel, but not a new combat system. That's no longer going to be the case with Mogami in the fleet, which will introduce training and personnel mobility challenges. The loss of 9LV is not the only change that Australian sailors are going to have to get used to. Adopting the Mogami will mean adopting a vast array of new systems, new weapons, new ways of doing things, which will make the transition difficult, and therefore potentially risky, while we build up the expertise we need. And we probably aren't going to be able to get that training en masse through operations with the Japanese. Now, of course, that's not to say that we can't or won't gain experience through working with the JMSDF. Australia and Japan share a robust diplomatic and defence partnership, with the recently negotiated Reciprocal Access Agreement being just short of a formal alliance, and frequent joint exercises and training ensure that the ADF and the JMSDF are as interoperable as they possibly can be. This closeness was further solidified just a few weeks ago with the signing of a trilateral naval logistics pact between Japan, Australia and the United States, so the relationship is clearly strong. But the best and most efficient way to train a sailor on a new platform is to put them onto one already running, and that's not straightforward with the Mogami and the JMSDF. Unsurprisingly, Japanese naval vessels are crewed by Japanese sailors who, surprise surprise, speak Japanese on board. The language and cultural barriers that exist between Japan and Australia are real, and as much as real efforts have been made and will be made to overcome them, they will impede Australian sailors from operating on Japanese vessels in large numbers, especially if there's a real fear that the vessel might be at risk of seeing action in an increasingly volatile part of the world. Such things aren't impossible, obviously. Specialised training cruises with English-fluent Japanese servicemen and women could probably be organised, and Australian exchanges for any Japanese-fluent Australian sailors who happen to be in the ranks will almost certainly be prioritised by the ADF. But we're never likely to have any significant number of personnel who can go and slot into Japanese operations the way we can with the Americans, the POMs, or the Kiwis. The second major hurdle is that the JMSDF's Mogamis are exactly that, original Mogamis, not the evolved variant that the RAN will be buying. By the time the Japanese get their own evolved Mogamis in the water, there won't be all that much time to train Japanese sailors up, let alone Australian sailors, before the first RAN examples are rolling off Japanese production lines. And while there certainly are major similarities between the older and newer class, it's something of an exaggeration to say that the evolved Mogami is just a larger version of the original ship. So while experience gained on board the older vessels will probably be valuable, it isn't necessarily going to map one-to-one onto the new ships. So the transition is going to be tough for the RAN and will probably take time. It's likely going to be far easier, though much slower, for the Japanese to offer to send English-speaking sailors down to Australia once the first ships are delivered than it would be to go the other way around in advance. But those challenges are nothing that can't be overcome. The far greater risk, in my opinion, comes before any ships are delivered at all, and that's in the commercial negotiations. I've discussed this aspect before and had some pushback in the comments when I did so, but it remains true that Japan has never exported a major military system in its modern history. That's not to say that they can't do it, that they're not clever enough or in some other way incapable of this kind of export. But these kind of major programs, which include not just multiple countries, but also multiple companies, from designers to shipbuilders to component suppliers to weapons manufacturers and more, entail layer after layer of complexity. Technology transfer, international industrial cooperation, conflicting schedules, conflicting demands, and more, all of which need to be smoothed out to mutual satisfaction of all parties across potential cultural and linguistic barriers, while at the same time keeping the project on schedule and under budget. That is enormously difficult at the best of times, and Australia, it can be argued, has a history as a particularly difficult customer for military equipment. The skills required to do this sort of deal well are, like any other skills, the kinds of things that get better with practice, and as of today, the Japanese simply haven't had that practice. We should anticipate challenges here. It's almost inevitable. The only question in my mind is how severe those challenges are, and whether they actually affect the delivery of the vessels in the long run. The way that the procurement process has played out to date, however, actually gives me quite a lot of hope here. It's very clear that the Japanese, both the government and the relevant suppliers, are really motivated to make sure this deal is a success. Whether that's because they want the diplomatic relationship boost with Australia, or because they want as many capable ships in the water as they can get in the event of a major conflict with China, or because they want a piece of the lucrative defense export market, or a combination of all of those reasons and more, the Japanese have bent over backwards, and there's every chance they're going to continue to do so during the build process. So this could turn out to be worry over nothing, but it's something we'll certainly need to keep an eye on. Another area where risk could be introduced is in the RAN or the Australian government's willingness to request changes to the design. As of today, the official line from the government, made very clear in the press conference, is that changes won't be happening, at least not without the express and specific authority of the National Security Committee of Cabinet. The policy today is, and I quote, that Australia will make no changes other than translation of the CMS and regulatory changes required under Australian law. Strict adherence to that policy, however, leads to some improbable and inconvenient potential consequences. For example, Will Australia acquire the Japanese weapons which equip these frigates by default? Will we find ourselves equipping our Mogamis with a Japanese Type 17 anti-ship missile instead of the Naval Strike Missile, a weapon which will not only equip every other Australian major surface combatant, but also one which will be manufactured domestically? What about the Japanese Type 12 torpedo? It's a 324mm torpedo, just like the ADF's existing MU-90s. Would we really see the adoption of a third torpedo type alongside the MU-90 and the Mark 48? It seems unlikely. The logistical burdens of maintaining a completely separate supply line and maintenance support system for these new weapons, which would essentially mirror existing capabilities, would be enormous for very little gain. So it seems only logical to request Australia's preferred weapons be integrated prior to delivery. But, and this is where it starts to get hairy, if we're open to changing the ship's armament, what about other features? The Nulka missile decoy, for example, is not only a sovereign Australian defence industry success story, but it's also relatively cheap and should be easy to equip on a ship of this size, and after all, it could be the difference between a ship and its crew living or dying in a major conflict. Can we really justify leaving it off the ship and sending our young men and women out to fight in a vessel that isn't defended to the absolute best of our ability? And, well, if we're already changing things, adding our weapons and our Nulka, well, what about other systems? After all, we've seen what drones are doing in Ukraine. We need drone defense and directed energy weapons on our surface ships. It wouldn't be much of an addition, and it just so happens that EOS happen to make exactly those things at their manufacturing facility in Hume in the ACT, which is in the federal electorate of Bean, which also just so happens to have been one of the closest seats at the last election, which Labor won by just a few hundred votes. For all the government's laudable intentions, arguments like these are going to be made, loudly and frequently, during the negotiations and the early design and construction work, both for self-serving or political reasons and also for entirely legitimate military reasons. And personally, I think it's unrealistic to expect that none of those arguments will find purchase at any point along the journey. Instead, it will be up to the government and the RAN to decide what changes justify their costs. And not just their costs in dollars, but also in time, in project complexity, and ultimately in project risk. So, we've covered why the Mogami was probably chosen, and we've covered what that means for the C3000 as a project. The ADF has taken a big swing, in some ways a high-risk, high-reward choice to try and get the most capability to sea that it can in the shortest time. But beyond C3000, beyond the short-term priorities, the Mogami selection has some pretty major big picture implications. To close out the video, we're going to run through a few of them now. Number 1. The RAM will lose some of its flexibility, at least on an individual ship level. As far as I can tell, it's still the position of the Navy, and the government generally, that the 6 Hunter-class frigates will replace the 8 existing Anzacs, and the Mogamis will be a new capability entirely. In practical reality, however, this is probably best understood as a hangover from the previous plan, which didn't include the Mogami or any Tier 2 vessels at all. In all the ways that matter, the Mogamis will replace the Anzacs as the Navy's workhorse assets. Purely by dint of their numbers, it will be the Mogami which will take on the majority of the Anzacs' more prosaic tasks, maritime patrol, naval diplomacy and presence missions, and probably doing most of the heavy lifting when it comes to Australia's contribution to multilateral operations, such as Operation Argos, enforcing UN Security Council sanctions against North Korea, or as part of Australia's contribution to the combined maritime forces in East Africa and the Middle East under Operation Manitou. The issue here, though, will come as the flip side to one of the Mogami's great strengths, its smaller crew numbers. While the ship may well be operable with just 90 people, especially once that crew is split into watches, that is likely to leave very little redundancy in terms of spare crew members who might be made available to undertake, say, a boarding operation. Similarly, in a HADR context, a Mogami is unlikely to be able to offer much by way of a shore party to assist after a disaster, at least compared to something like an Anzac. Now, that's not the end of the world. Australia will still have plenty of more crew-intensive vessels over the next several decades, and as the Army's landing craft come online, in particular the landing craft heavies, which are based on the 3,900-ton Damen LST-100, we will find ourselves with far more options when it comes to moving large numbers of personnel around. But selecting the Mogami will mean that when it comes to vessels who find themselves Johnny on the spot in an emergent situation, we may have fewer options than we would with a different class of ship. Number 2. The Australia-Japan relationship inevitably gets closer. As discussed previously, Australia and Japan don't have an alliance in the formal diplomatic sense. In fact, outside of New Zealand and the United States, we don't technically have any allies at all. But the two nations have about as close a relationship as it's possible to have, short of that formal step, with the 2015 Economic Agreement facilitating enormous trade between the two countries, while the 2023 Reciprocal Access Agreement formalised and broadened military-to-military partnerships. We're also both members of the Quad, a regional partnership aimed pretty squarely at countering and containing China, and recently signed a joint logistics agreement along with the US. But with Australia becoming Japan's first major military export customer, and picking up a fleet of these Evolved Mogamis, which is likely to be just about as big as Japan's own, further tightening of that relationship seems not just likely, but inevitable. At the very least, the two countries can be expected to collaborate on maintenance and upgrade packages over the years, sharing learnings about their respective ships. Potentially, this might even extend into joint, or at least mutually accessible, maintenance facilities, with Japanese ships potentially undergoing maintenance in Australian yards, or vice versa. Certainly, in a major regional war, having access to maintenance facilities a long way from the front lines, with a workforce already deeply familiar with one of their major ship classes, would be an enormous boon to the JMSTF. While in peacetime, potentially overstretched Australian yards might mean the Navy would appreciate access to highly efficient, experienced and well-staffed Japanese facilities. The benefits are significant for both sides, and I'd honestly be surprised if the two nations didn't at least try to negotiate some kind of agreement along those lines. Away from the ships themselves and cooperation opportunities directly related to them, there's plenty of scope for further joint Australian-Japanese efforts. The big one, which has been ventilated plenty of times in the media over the last several years, would be the expansion of AUKUS, particularly Pillar 2, to include Japan. But that's not the only possibility. Australia will need to replace its Super Hornets in the coming decades, and diversifying the Air Force away from being a purely US-derived force is looking more and more attractive by the day. Japan is a major part of the GCAP program, along with the UK and Italy, and while Australia probably isn't about to join as a Tier 1 partner, though apparently the Australian government has been extensively briefed on the project, jumping in some kind of lesser capacity might be an option. Along the same lines, we could potentially see some capability flow the other way. If Japan also wants to make a gesture to deepen the alliance, perhaps we might see some of Australia's military exports flowing the other way, with maybe the biggest potential, if not necessarily the most likely, being the MQ-28 Ghostbat drone. And while it's all very well for the Defence Minister to say that none of this was a consideration when choosing the ship, I think it's safe to say that it's simply not creditable. Australia's geopolitical neighbourhood is getting more and more dangerous, as the government continually reminds us, and the US is becoming less and less reliable. It would be geopolitical malpractice for the government not to be at least thinking about broadening Australia's relationships right now. And while the EU is important, and we are growing that military and diplomatic relationship, in an actual conflict, when the rubber hits the road, there's only so much that the EU could actually do to assist Australia. At the end of the day, geography matters, and the EU is very far away. and very short on force projection capabilities that could make it over here. Japan, meanwhile, is right there, and that counts for a hell of a lot when the bombs start dropping and the missiles start flying. It would not be above anyone in the national security establishment to potentially tweak the specific selection criteria to make sure that the most geopolitically appropriate ship got chosen, purely on capability, of course. Number 3. New Zealand probably, though not definitely, continues to diverge from Australia as far as the surface fleet goes. New Zealand and Australia have two of the most tightly integrated militaries in the world, and there was some speculation that the Kiwis might consider buying whatever Tier 2 vessel emerged from the Australian competition to replace their own Anzac frigates. After all, those frigates were originally acquired jointly by New Zealand and Australia, and that program has generally been considered a fantastic success. However, acquiring the Mogami from the New Zealand Navy seems, at least to my eyes, to go against New Zealand's stated intentions. New Zealand's 2025 Defence Capability Plan, essentially their version of our DSR, described their plans for replacing the Anzacs as such. Quote, "The current fleet comprises 8 ships across 5 classes, with many aspects of unique and customised design. Maintenance, operation and training varies significantly between ship classes. As such, considerations to simplify the fleet, including the potential for a common hull design for the frigate and patrol vessel replacement, will be considered." End quote. This was reiterated a few paragraphs later. Quote, "The Anzac frigates will be replaced with comparable contemporary frigates, and the offshore patrol vessels will also be replaced, with consideration given to whether commonality of design or systems with the frigates may be possible." End quote. So, while the Mogami probably ticks a lot of the same boxes for New Zealand as it does for Australia, it fails the test laid out here in several ways. First, it would be hard to describe the Mogami as a comparable frigate to the current Anzac class. In every way, it is a significant step up, in size, in capability, and in complexity. Second, it's almost inconceivable that the Kiwis could afford to replace both their frigates and their OPVs with Evolved Mogamis. While the whole of life savings might indeed be compelling, the upfront cost to purchase 4 of them is probably beyond New Zealand's budget in the short term. Had Australia opted to go for the less complex and cheaper to acquire A200, I think it would have been more plausible to expect the Kiwis to follow us into that purchase. But as it is, I expect they'll probably take their own path and acquire something a little smaller and cheaper, though this is one area where my conviction is pretty low. I don't think we'll see Mogamis flying the Kiwi flag anytime soon, but I wouldn't be completely shocked if it did happen. Number 4. Australia will acquire and operate the RIM 116. The Evolved Mogami acquisition will see Australia operating the RIM 116 rolling airframe missile for the first time, in the form of the C-RAM missile launcher, which is used by the ship in place of something like the older gun-based phalanx system for close-in air defence. Personally, I see this as a big positive that comes with the Mogami over the European offering. Close-in defence against missiles which make it through the ship's broader area air defences is currently an area of weakness for the RAN's frigates, with the phalanx being fitted on our DDGs, LHDs and AROs, but absent on our Anzacs, despite being fitted to the New Zealand Navy's equivalent frigates. This leaves close-in air defence essentially non-existent beyond the ship's main guns, and it's encouraging that missile defence is being augmented not only by the larger VLS magazine of the Mogami as compared to the Anzac, but also by the addition of a competent close-in system. Perhaps even more significant, however, is the potential to expand the application of the RIM 116 beyond the Mogamis, now that we know it'll one day soon make up part of the RAN's arsenal. I've previously made a video suggesting that this missile could find a home on board the Arafura class OPVs, potentially through the C-RAM system, but ideally tied in more directly to a more capable SeaTac radar system, which could also be added to the vessels. I'm going to take the upcoming adoption of the RIM 116 as a small, very small, smidgen of hope that that particular upgrade might actually happen one day in the distant future. But beyond my own personal preferences and harebrained schemes, the RIM 116 is ultimately just a very capable weapon that can be made very modular and easily deployable through the CRAM system, and as a result, can make just about any small combatant with a deadweight capacity to carry it that much more survivable and potent. If the RAN is ever going to end up with a kind of small, capable ships that are going to be about all we could reliably make in numbers in a conflict scenario, be they corvettes, missile boats, fast attack craft, whatever, having an onshore stockpile or well-established supply chain for these missiles are going to make them materially more capable. And that latent capacity is nothing but a good thing. Number 5. The RAM will become extremely capable underwater. The Mogami, the actual Mogami currently in service with the JMSDF, is an ASW thoroughbred, designed and built almost exclusively for undersea warfare. The Evolved Mogami is a bit more of a generalist, but still carries enough of that Mogami DNA that it remains very much ASW focused. Let's take a quick glance forward in time and consider the RAN of the early 2040s. By then, we should have 8 or 9 Mogamis in service, with a couple more on the way, all focused primarily on anti-submarine warfare. At the same time, all 6 of the Hunters, our Tier 1 exquisite and again ASW focused assets, should at least be delivered, if not necessarily commissioned. HMAS Canberra and HMAS Adelaide will be approaching the end of their service lives, but will probably still be in operation, and when they're not serving in an amphibious role, their greatest value will probably be as ASW helicopter carriers, equipped with multiple Seahawks to prosecute submerged targets. And who knows, by then maybe some fixed-wing drones as well, dropping sonobuoys. In fact, in the early to mid-2040s, only the 3 Hobart-class air warfare destroyers, hopefully well on their way to being replaced by then, but still in active service, will be anything but ASW focused. This represents an enormous change from the current fleet, which features only 3 ships, those same Hobarts, which can even deploy a towed array sonar, with ASW currently being undertaken predominantly from helicopters and maritime patrol aircraft. Now, to be clear, I'm not saying that this is a bad thing, nor that we could have or should have done anything else. As discussed earlier, choosing the MECO might have gotten us a better air warfare sensor suite, but probably only at the expense of magazine depth, which would actually allow the ship to fight in the air. And as the Pacific generally and the PLAN specifically gradually fills up with more and more capable submarine assets, from massive nuclear attack boats to small unmanned UUVs, a regionally significant ASW capability is hardly a bad thing, especially given the fact that it will be submarines, not surface ships, which pose the greatest threat to Australia's critical supply lines through the Indian and Southern Pacific Oceans in the event of a conflict with China. Overall, I'm happy with the outcome of the C3000 selection process. I don't think that the Mogami is a panacea for the problems of the RAN, but nor would selecting the MECO have been. I think there are still other gaps to fill in the Navy's order of battle. We need to sort out the issues with the supply class AORs, which have left us all but incapable of at-sea refueling and resupply. We need to reconsider how we're going to do mine warfare and hydrography as we retire the Huons and the Lewins. We need to sort out the maintenance and readiness issues that have recently been highlighted by the GAO. And while this is probably more of a personal obsession than a true military need, I still think that even with the Mogamis, there's going to be a gap in the RAN's fleet for something smaller, cheaper, and less capable that could ensure we had more meaningfully armed hulls in the water before the end of the decade. That could be something custom, like the modern Bathurst concept I outlined several videos ago, or an Arafura refit to turn those OPVs into something resembling a very basic Corvette, or some other kind of light, cheap, missile-armed fast attack craft or Corvette which we could quickly sole source from any one of half a dozen competent overseas or even domestic manufacturers. But outside of the fantasy land of personal preference and back in the real world, where the choice was between Miko and Mogami, I think they chose the better option in a decision where there really wasn't a truly bad choice to be made. Yes, it will be harder in some ways, and yes, there's commercial risk that maybe wouldn't have been there in the TKMS bid. But the Mogami shows an Australian government willing to take risks to ensure that the absolute most capable piece of kit ends up in Australian service, and it shows a commitment to meaningful alliance building in the Asia Pacific. There are going to be teething problems and challenges during the rollout and the transition to the new class. Let's not pretend there won't be. And when those problems inevitably crop up, there will be people gleefully crowing about how they knew it all along and none of this would be happening if we just bought the Miko when we had the chance. And hell, maybe they'll be right. But at the end of the day, I'm confident that the RAN and Australia as a whole will be better off with these ships in its fleet than we would have been under the old plan. And that counts for a hell of a lot.